very warm welcome to the last of this year's Cadbury Lectures by Professor William Lane Craig. I know that for some of you, this is not the first one you've been to. In fact, I can see quite a number of familiar faces who I saw the other night. So welcome back to you, and thanks for attending, and welcome to those who are here for the first time tonight. And I'll hand over to Dr. Lane Craig. But one of the things I was asked to do, there are quite a number of books out on the store there. So if you'd like to, when you've heard the lecture, like to take something away and read further, do go and buy a book. I have to say, I went away from Wednesday night's lecture thinking, this has been about the most intellectually stimulating and stretching evening of my entire year so far. I need to read more about this, so I recommend the book.
Thank you. I've certainly enjoyed our week here in Birmingham, not only delivering the lectures, but also visiting some of the area, and it's just been a delight for Jan and me to be with you. In our last lecture, we saw that the criterion of ontological commitment that lies at the heart of the indispensability argument for Platonism has been plausibly challenged in whole or in part by neo-Meinongians, neutralists, and free logicians, so that it can hardly be said to be incumbent upon the classical theist. This fact alone suffices to defeat the indispensability argument for Platonism. But what about premise 2 of that argument? It states there are literally true simple sentences containing singular terms that refer to things that could only be abstract objects. Likewise, there are literally true existential statements whose existential quantifiers range over things that could only be abstract objects. If there are plausible ways of regarding such sentences as not literally true, then the indispensability argument will be doubly defeated, so to speak. Premise 2 of the indispensability argument is challenged by fictionalism, figuralism, and pretense theory. Fictionalism denies that abstract object talk is true. Figuralism holds that abstract object talk is not literally true because it is figurative language. Pretense theory holds that abstract object talk is a matter of make-believe and therefore need not be taken to be true. Let's look more closely first at pretense theory. The essential point of pretense theory is that whether or not abstract object sentences are true, we are invited to pretend that they are true. If we have good reasons, as the theist does, to think that uncreated abstract objects do not exist, the objects of such discourse may be taken to be mere pretense and nothing more. Contemporary theories of fiction draw much of their inspiration from the brilliant, pioneering work of University of Michigan professor of philosophy, Kendall Walton. Walton takes the practice of make-believe to lie at the heart of fiction. The central idea of the make-believe approach, says Walton, is that what seem to be commitments by speakers of theories to non-existent entities are to be understood in a spirit of pretense or make-believe. He thinks that the activities which produce representational works of art, like literature, painting, film, and so forth, are best seen as continuous with children's games of make-believe. In support of his viewpoint, Walton makes the interesting observation, and I quote, "Children devote enormous quantities of time and effort to make-believe activities, and this preoccupation seems to be nearly universal, not peculiar to any particular cultures or social groups. The urge to engage in make-believe and the needs such activities address would seem to be very fundamental ones. If they are, one would not expect children to simply outgrow them when they grow up. It would be surprising if make-believe disappeared without a trace at the onset of adulthood. In Walton's view, artistic activities, such as the ones just mentioned, are themselves games of make-believe. Such games are a type of imaginative activity. Walton gives examples to illustrate this familiar activity. Fred imagines himself to be rich. Jennifer imagines herself coming across a bear in the forest, and so forth. Prescribed imagining lies at the heart of Walton's theory of fiction. Fictional propositions are propositions which in certain contexts we are to imagine to be true. Walton recognizes that some propositions which are fictional may not, strictly speaking, be prescribed because they are trivial or distracting. For example, that Hamlet had a heart. Nevertheless, they are prescribed to be imagined should the question arise. Games of make-believe involve certain explicit or implicit understandings, what Walton calls principles of generation, as to what someone playing the game is to imagine to be true. These principles of generation may or may not be explicit. Walton thinks that some principles of generation, and I quote, including most involving works of art, are never explicitly agreed on or even formulated, and imaginers may be unaware of them, at least in the sense of being able to spell them out, end quote. But those who play the game correctly have an implicit understanding of what is to be imagined, though in some cases uncertainty and disagreement may persist. Walton emphasizes that truth and fictionality are not mutually exclusive. Some of the propositions prescribed to be imagined by a historical fiction like War and Peace, for example, may be true. Even if all the sentences in a novel about the future, like Orwell's 1984, turned out to be true, that novel still remains fiction. Similarly, in the case of a novel whose sentences accurately describe events on some unknown planet in the universe, what is essential to fictionality is not falsehood, but a prescription to be imagined. This cursory sketch of Walton's theory of fiction does not do justice to its fascinating richness, but it does serve to draw our attention to some of the salient features of pretense theory when it is applied to abstract discourse, the centrality of make-believe, the importance of prescribed imagining, the neutrality of fiction with regard to the truth value of propositions which are to be imagined, the absence of any challenge to the neo-Quinean view of quantification and reference. All are elements adapted by pretense theorists in dealing with discourse about abstract objects. Mary Leng is an anti-realist philosopher of mathematics of the University of Liverpool who embraces Walton's theory of fiction in order to deal with the alleged commitments of our best scientific theories to mathematical objects. She proposes to treat the applied mathematical sentences of scientific theories as fictional or prescribed to be imagined true. Leng regards the mathematical objects appearing in our scientific theories to be merely useful fictions. She explains, and I quote, "It is reasonable to view the assumption that there are mathematical objects that are related to non-mathematical objects in various ways as generative of a fiction, which provides us with a means, indirectly, to represent non-mathematical objects and their relations. Merely pretending that there are mathematical objects satisfying the axioms of a given mathematical theory provides us with a means to represent non-mathematical objects as being related to these mathematical objects in certain ways. All that is confirmed by our empirical successes is that these hypotheses are indeed fictional. That is, that they are correct in their representation of the non-mathematical objects they concern. The echoes of Walton's theory of fiction are unmistakable. The notions of pretense, principles of generation, fiction, representation, statements being fictional, all trace back to Walton's work. An important objection to interpreting mathematics as make-believe is that mathematics is not of the genre of fiction. In particular, mathematics is not to all appearances a matter of make-believe. Mathematicians and scientists take mathematics to be a body of knowledge and a realm of discovery, not invention. To regard mathematical statements as fictional is to distort the nature of this discipline. In weighing this objection, we need to keep in mind that the pretense theorist is not defending a hermeneutical claim about how professional mathematicians or scientists in fact understand mathematical sentences. In order to undercut the indispensability argument for Platonism, the pretense theorist need show only that mathematical sentence can reasonably be taken to be fictional. So, we may ask, are the differences between fiction and mathematics so great that mathematical sentences, whether pure or applied, cannot be reasonably regarded as fictional? Remember that the truth of a sentence is not incompatible with that sentence's being fictional. So the supposed truth of mathematical sentences is not grounds for denying their status as fictional. Rather, the objection must be that mathematics is not reasonably construed to be a matter of make-believe. But why not? Why can we not reasonably take mathematical statements as prescribed to be imagined to be true rather than believed to be true? It might be said that mathematical theories are altogether lacking in such prescriptions to imagine. But the absence of such prescriptions is of little significance, since, as Walton notes, representational works of art typically lack such explicit prescriptions. Mathematics, being a collective enterprise, even lacks any author's intent to guide us in our interpretation. Perhaps mathematics is, in that respect, like mythology, which people can take either literally or fictionally. In fact, there are some features of mathematics that make it seem a prime candidate for a fictional interpretation. I shall mention 3 such features. In the first place, axiomatization of mathematical theories naturally invites a pretense theoretical interpretation. For example, the axioms of standard set theory are plausibly taken as prescribed to be imagined true. University of California philosopher of mathematics Penelope Matty distinguishes between believing the axioms of standard set theory and defending the axioms of standard set theory. Although such an apologetic concern seems at first blush to assume that the axioms are true and that it is the truth of the axioms that is to be defended, what Matty is in fact talking about is defending the use of the axioms, regardless of their truth. Indeed, her aim is, quote, to shift attention away from elusive matters of truth and existence, end quote. In Matty's view, what justifies the use of set theoretical axioms is fruitfulness. Axioms are properly adopted which are rich in mathematical consequences, or what Matty calls mathematical depth. In short, we do not have to believe the axioms in order to use the axioms. Consider the axioms of standard set theory. It is striking that with the exception of the axiom of infinity, these axioms are all universally quantified statements, devoid of any existential implications. One advantage of pretense theory over deductivism is that we need not construe the axiom of infinity to have any other logical form than its apparent form. Rather, one takes the axiom of infinity as something we are prescribed to imagine. We are to make believe there is an infinity of these things called sets, and then are free to explore the fictional world of our imagination. This will certainly be a journey of discovery, which will issue in a great deal of knowledge of the mathematical world determined by the axioms. Such an attitude toward the axioms of set theory is not uncommon among mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics themselves. For example, postulationalism, which treats the axioms of competing theories as postulates whose consequences may be explored, invites us, in effect, to make believe that the axioms are true without committing ourselves to their objective truth. But is it plausible to take the axiom of infinity as something prescribed to be imagined rather than as a straightforward metaphysical assertion? I think the answer is obviously affirmative. It is universally admitted that the axiom of infinity is not intuitively obvious. Its lack of intuitive warrant was one of the heavy stones that helped to sink logicism, an early 20th century attempt to derive set theory from logic alone. Since the axiom lacks intuitive warrant, the axiom of infinity is adopted by contemporary mathematicians for reasons that are variously called pragmatic or regressive or extrinsic, reasons which do not justify its truth, but its mathematical utility. Moreover, as Michael Potter points out, there are multiple versions of the axiom of infinity which postulate different sets. A defense of the axiom on pragmatic grounds, says Potter, does not directly give us a ground for preferring one sort of axiom of infinity over another, since any of them will work. As a result, says Potter, Platonists have frustratingly little they can say by way of justification for their preferred version of the axiom. As a serious assertion of ontology, the axiom of infinity is a breathtaking assertion that utterly outstrips our intuitions. If any conception of sets had a claim to be intuitive, it would be the conception of 19th century naive set theory, which turned out to be riddled with logical paradoxes. Axiomatization was an ad hoc fix aimed at precluding the paradoxes inherent in naive set theory. If we take the axioms of standard set theory merely as prescribing what we are to imagine, such stipulations are unobjectionable. But if we take them as serious ontological assertions about the existence of mind-independent objects, we have left behind any intuitive support for the existence of such things. In sum, axiomatic set theory seems to be a perfect candidate for a pretense theoretical approach. The philosopher of mathematics Stuart Shapiro observes, and I quote, "The strongest versions of working realism are no more than claims that mathematics can or should be practiced as if the subject matter were a realm of independently existing abstract eternal entities." End quote. This characterization would make working realists into pretense theorists. We are invited to imagine the axioms are true and then are free to explore the fictional world established by such prescriptions. Indeed, many mathematicians do in fact so understand the axioms. A second respect in which set theory seems particularly apt for a fictional interpretation concerns the creative freedom enjoyed by the mathematician. Just as authors of literary fiction are free to shape their characters as they wish without concern for correspondence with reality, so mathematicians are at liberty to craft and explore different axiomatic systems without worrying that they are misrepresenting reality in doing so. Abraham Frankl has spoken eloquently of abstract set theory as showing, and I quote, that possibility of free creation in mathematics which is not equaled in any other science. It is no accident that at the birth of the theory of sets there was coined the sentence, the very essence of mathematics is its freedom, end quote. The freedom of the creative mathematician is, he says, restricted only by the postulate of consistency, of logical non-contradiction. In Frankl's view, sets are logical fictions, that is to say, abstract concepts which are the result of an intellectual act of collecting things into an aggregate. So, set theorists have felt free to formulate quite a variety of set theories, some with different ontologies. For example, von Neumann-Bernays' Gödel set theory, NBG, includes, in addition to sets, mathematical objects called classes, which are governed by a universal principle of comprehension. NBG thus has a fundamentally different ontology than standard set theory. Potter lists 4 variable features of what he calls the enormously varied potpourri of set theories. 1, whether there are individuals or just pure sets. 2, how many levels there are in the hierarchy of sets. 3, how rich a conception there is, once a level is given, of the level that follows it in the hierarchy. And 4, whether there are classes as well as sets. Moreover, theorists working within the axioms of standard set theory are at liberty to bracket certain axioms which are independent of the others and to explore the consequences. Zermelo Fraenkel's set theory, without the axiom of choice, is probably the most familiar example, but one might omit instead the axiom of foundation. On the other hand, one might add freely axioms to standard set theory. Adding an axiom of constructibility will ensure that the constructible, or rather the universe of constructible sets, L, is identical to the entire realm of sets, V. In the absence of an axiom of constructibility, the mathematician's imagination may soar boundlessly through inaccessible cardinals, malo cardinals, indescribable cardinals, to partition cardinals, measurable cardinals, and so on. Pretense theory makes far better sense of this remarkable freedom than does Platonism. For within the bounds of logical consistency, we are free to make believe that there are mathematical entities of every imaginable sort, and to explore the consequences without concern that we are thereby somehow misdescribing reality. Maddie observes that mathematicians employ what she calls maximizing principles of a sort quite unlike anything that turns up in the practice of natural science. Crudely, she says, the scientist posits only those entities without which she cannot account for the observations, while the set theorist posits as many entities as she can, short of inconsistency. Such a modus operandi seems objectionable given realism. Realism, if taken seriously, would be a positive impediment to mathematical practice and progress. The maximizing principles Maddie mentions are unobjectionable on a pretense theoretical approach, since we are at liberty to make believe as we choose. But such freedom is hard to reconcile with Platonic realism. Platonism cannot accept such principles, since we have not only an abundance of nice rival theories, but more fundamentally no warrant to think that niceness coincides with reality in the first place. Set theory is typically regarded as foundational for the rest of mathematics, since the whole of mathematics can be reductively analyzed in terms of pure sets. Such a reductive analysis makes sense on a pretense theoretical approach. We imagine that there are objects, such as are characterized by the set theoretical axioms, and we allow them to stand in for all other mathematical objects. As Maddie explains, the mathematical benefits of such a procedure are impressive in terms of exposing inconsistencies, organizing knowledge, leading to theories of greater power and fruitfulness, and so on. But these benefits do not depend on set theoretical foundations providing any sort of metaphysical insight into reality. A realist ought to be skeptical of such reductive analyses, since the ability to represent, for example, numbers as sets in no way proves that numbers are sets. Indeed, such a claim may seem intuitively bizarre, for we do not normally take numbers, for example, to have members, as sets do. Moreover, different set theoretical reductions of mathematical objects are available and equally tenable. We can make believe that numbers are the sets defined by Zermelo, or we can make believe that numbers are von Neumann's sets, and it will make no difference to mathematical practice. Finally, a third respect in virtue of which set theory is especially amenable to a pretense theoretical interpretation is the incompleteness of mathematical entities. One of the most striking features of fictional characters is their incompleteness. It is not merely unknown whether, for example, Hamlet was left-handed or Sherlock Holmes wore a size 9 shoe. Rather, there is no fact of the matter at all about such things, because there are no fictional truths concerning such matters. It is neither fictional that Hamlet was left-handed, nor fictional that Hamlet was right-handed. It is for that reason that many philosophers think that Hamlet could not possibly exist. For real objects are complete, at least if they are concrete, and there is nothing that would make a left-handed Hamlet, rather than a right-handed Hamlet, really be Hamlet. The mathematical objects of infinite set theory are incomplete in a number of significant ways. The most celebrated example is the continuum hypothesis, abbreviated CH, that the number of real numbers is Aleph 1, the successor to Aleph null, which is the number of natural numbers. Paul Cohen demonstrated in 1963 that CH is independent of the standard set theoretical axioms. The pretense theorist plausibly maintains that CH is neither fictional nor not fictional in the game prescribed by these axioms. Of course, the mathematician is free to play a different game using different principles of generation, and in some of these, CH may be fictional. The pretense theorist may surely be excused if he is skeptical about the objectivity of such conjectural systems. In summary, we've seen three features of set theory which make it especially amenable to a pretense theoretical interpretation: the axiomatization of conflicting set theories that outstrip any intuitions that may have undergirded naive set theory; second, the creative freedom of the mathematician to extend the mathematical realm as far as consistency allows; and three, the incompleteness of the mathematical objects referred to in mathematical theories. These seem to make a pretense theoretical approach to such objects at least as plausible as Platonism. Now, on occasion, we shall be forced to abandon the pretense in order to make our metaphysical commitments, or lack thereof, clear. We shall want to say, for example, there are no uncreated abstract objects. In this case, we are using the first-order quantifier in a metaphysically heavy sense. When we do so, says neo-Quinian Ted Sider, we are no longer speaking ordinary English, but a new language, which he calls ontologies, whose quantifiers are stipulated to carve reality at the joints. If one stipulates that there is or there are is being used to indicate ontological commitments, then of course the anti-realist will regard a statement like there are odd numbers as false. We are then speaking ontologies, not the language of pretense. We can make this clear by rhetorical devices or modifying phrases like there really are no uncreated abstract objects, or there are no uncreated abstract objects in a metaphysically heavyweight sense of there are. Ontologies is the language spoken by the fictionalist when he says that abstract object statements are untrue. But given a deflationary theory of reference, such as we examined in our last lecture, we need not go so far as the fictionalist in treating singular terms as devices of ontological commitment, even in ontologies. Rather, with the free logician and with Quine himself, we may take only the logical quantifiers of ontologies to be ontologically committing. We can still affirm the truth of predications involving singular terms for things like numbers and properties. For example, 2 + 2 = 4, and wisdom is exemplified by Socrates, without implying that there is something which is identical to 4, or there is something which is exemplified by Socrates. Since in free logic, the rules of existential generalization and universal instantiation apply only to things of which metaphysically heavyweight existence has been truly predicated, and we have not agreed nor asserted that 2 + 2 exists or that wisdom exists. Thus, one need not, with the fictionalist, deny the truth of such predications. Now, much more deserves to be said about these matters, but my time is nearly gone. When I commenced my study of divine aseity over a dozen years ago, I anticipated that I should be defending the historic Christian position with respect to abstract objects, namely divine conceptualism. While divine conceptualism remains for me a fallback position, its difficulties, in particular the ill-suitedness of divine thoughts to play the roles attributed to various abstract objects, make it a less attractive option than it at first appeared to be. It is noteworthy, moreover, that church fathers who apparently espoused conceptualism did not always attribute a substantial existence to the divine thoughts standing in for abstract objects. Many of them, I suspect, were actually closer to anti-realism than to divine psychologism. The overriding point, however, is that there just is no compelling reason to be a realist. The indispensability argument, which is the centerpiece of contemporary Platonism, is, in my studied opinion, a hopeless argument. Both its premises are plausibly false. But for the purposes of our study, so bold an opinion need not be defended. In order to defeat the indispensability argument, one need not rebut any of its premises, but simply undercut the warrant for one of its premises. Given how controversial the debate over contemporary Platonism is, no view can plausibly commend itself philosophically to the exclusion of all others. I conclude that the challenge posed by Platonism to the doctrine of divine aseity can be successfully met. We may affirm without reservation Paul's doxology in Romans 9:5, God, who is over all, be blessed forever. Amen.
Thank you for another very truly stimulating lecture. We have about just over half an hour for questions before this evening's reception, so hands up for any questions. Yeah.
Hi, I know you finished with there is no reason to be a realist, and I'm absolutely on your side there. I really am. But when you talk about fictionalism or pretense theory, it seems that you're making a strong claim for a particular way of looking at the world. But I don't see why it's entailed by not being a realist, or not being a literalist, or not being a Platonist, or anything in that particular camp. So, I was...
Can you bring up the alternative slides? The one with all the alternatives?
Oh, right. Figure one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking particularly of something that Davidson would have said about metaphor, or Rorty would have said about metaphor, about how all language is metaphor.
Yes.
It wouldn't entail... it sort of avoids literalism and realism, but I don't know how that would entail fictionalism or pretense theory.
Right. Right, it wouldn't. I love this question because Heather May, on the way to the lecture tonight, said, Bill, having given these lectures, do you have any sense of what you've said or what you would like to have done differently? And I said, the sense I have is how abbreviated these lectures have been. For example, I led off tonight by saying that premise 2 is challenged by fictionalism, figuralism, and pretense theory, and then I talked about pretense theory most of the evening, and a little bit about fictionalism, and said nothing about figuralism. And yet, that is the alternative that you're talking about, which is defended by Stephen Yablo today, and I find extremely persuasive. And what Yablo says is that abstract object talk is the use of existential metaphors. And he has a fascinating comparison between metaphorical speech and abstract object talk that I find very compelling. So you're absolutely right. An anti-realist approach doesn't entail any of these particular views. On the contrary, what I want to do is open up for the theist a whole range of options. And I don't have a settled opinion as to whether to be a figuralist, a pretense theorist, a neutralist, a free logician. My sympathies are very strongly with neutralism. Is that on the? Yeah, there it is, neutralism. What I said last night, I'm convinced that singular terms and existential quantification are not devices of ontological commitment. But beyond that, there will be times when we do want to speak in a metaphysically heavy way, and the question then will be, should we then be fictionalists when we're doing that? And I addressed that a little bit tonight, but you're absolutely right. There are this range of options that I think are all defensible, frankly. And that's the strength of the anti-realist position. You see, for the Platonist argument against divine aseity to go through, he has to eliminate all of these alternatives and say that these are not plausible, rational options for the theist to take today. The theist has got to be a realist, got to be a Platonist, and I find that really an indefensible claim. Now, if you're interested in my take on figuralism, I did a lecture, I think it was last year, or was it 2 years ago?
November 2013.
So that would have been 2 years ago, for the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford on figuralism and abstract object talk. And it turns out C.S. Lewis was a figuralist of sorts. He actually addressed this question in one of his essays and took this approach of treating mathematical discourse as metaphorical. This is on YouTube. So if you Google my name and probably something like C.S. Lewis Society or God and the Platonic Host is the name of the lecture. That's on YouTube, and that would supplement what I wish I could have said tonight.
Great, thank you very much.
Yes.
Further questions? Eugene.
So you have reached anti-realism of mathematical objects, and for you that's good news because you're a theist, and anti-realism is compatible with theism. Do you think it's an option for atheists as well? So can atheists just agree with everything that is said throughout these lectures?
I think that atheists could agree with everything that I've said except for divine conceptualism. Obviously, the atheist couldn't hold to that, but or absolute creationism either, I guess. But all of these other options are typically defended by people who, so far as I know, have no theistic commitments. In fact, one of the exciting things about this, I have to say, as a Christian philosopher, is building bridges and connections between theology and these areas that are largely unexplored. There's hardly anybody that is doing this kind of integrative theological, philosophical work. Getting to know people like Jody Azuni, for example, a neutralist at Tufts University, I think he was quite bewildered that there was this Christian philosopher who found his work so interesting and helpful, and it was quite a revelation for him to see the theological applications of this. Similarly with Arvid Bove, the Swedish philosopher, when I contacted him. So I think part of the fascination of this work from the standpoint of the theist is that it is so unplowed, and there's creative new work to be done in these areas.
When you're talking about the way in which the pretense theory with mathematical axioms relates to non-mathematical objects, I felt it was very like the action of catalyst, that you have a catalyst and therefore you can get to where two or more non-mathematical objects relate to each other without them being affected by the nature of the catalyst.
That's a wonderful analogy, and although Mary Lang doesn't use that analogy, that is a great analogy for what she's saying. She says the real purpose of scientific theories is not to describe the relationship between mathematical objects and physical things in the world. It's ultimately to help us understand the physical world, and these mathematical objects are merely useful devices for getting at the nature of physical reality. So they're like catalysts chemically in that they facilitate the project, but they're not really the end in mind. That's not the thing you're going for. And particularly with regard to idealizations in science, this is very evident. Things like the frictionless plane, or points at infinity, or taking gases to be ideal continuous gases or ideal fluids composed of a continuum of points. These sorts of idealizations are clearly, I think, just useful fictions. And she would use that as a means of kind of breaking the ground or breaking the resistance to saying that all of the mathematical apparatus is like that, just useful fictions for getting at the nature of physical reality.
I think it's really interesting the way that you want to go to anti-realism for maths, but I was wondering if you, by adopting this sort of fictionalist view, couldn't you also adopt a fictionalist view for ethics? So for a lot of ethical statements, you might want to say that abstract objects would be, what you take in a specifically heavy sense. And so we don't have to take them objectively in maths, but we can still take them seriously. We can still prescribe them to imagine that they're true and they're still binding on you, and you've still got epistemic duties to accept them and all this sort of stuff. But can't you do the same then in morality?
You could,
So why
and there are philosophers who do. For example, fictionalism is a kind of error theory, and that is exactly what some ethicists would claim, is that they are these things that look like moral truths are not in fact truths, they're falsehoods. So someone like J.L. Mackie would adopt a sort of error theory, which would correspond exactly to fictionalism. But on the other hand, a neutralist could say that there are moral truths, even though they're not ontologically committing to abstract objects like Platonic values, like greed or virtue or rapacity or love or things of that sort, even though we refer to them in moral truths. So I think there would be corresponding to these various viewpoints, various alternatives in ethical theory too. And then the question would be, well, should you be an error theorist or a moral anti-realist? And you remember my grounds for being an anti-realist about abstract objects are purely theological. I did not present any philosophical argument for anti-realism or anti-Platonism. My grounds are theological, and I don't have any theological grounds for being an anti-realist about moral values and truths. Quite the contrary, I would be a moral realist because of that. And philosophically, I would agree with a comment made by Louise Antony of University of Massachusetts in Amherst in a debate we had on the foundations of morality. She remarked that any argument for moral skepticism will be less obvious than or rather, the premises in any argument for moral skepticism will be less obvious than the existence of objective moral values and duties themselves, so that moral skepticism or anti-realism could never be justified. And I'm inclined to agree with that.
Sorry, I don't think I articulated myself very clearly.
Oh.
So in this we want to say that we can still take mathematics seriously, even though we're not taking it to be objectively true. There aren't these Platonic objects out there, but we can still take it in this lightweight sense, and we can still take it seriously in the sense that we still have mathematical discourse and all the things in there. Right. But in your, say, moral arguments, you want to say that we want to say there are objective moral values, because without them it seems that then we can't take them seriously.
Right.
But it seems that if in mathematical discourse we can separate taking things seriously from taking things objectively, then why can't we go to our moral discourse and say, well, similarly here, I can separate, even if you're not willing to, I can separate objectivity from seriousness, and then say what you really want is to take morality seriously, and then that undercuts...
All right, I think that my answer would be, again, very similar. It's going to depend on which of these views you adopt. If you go with fictionalism, then you have to say that not only are there no moral values and duties, but there are no moral truths either, and I don't want to go that route. But I would be very happy to ground objective moral values not as abstract objects. So I would reject that branch of the diagram, and I would ground them in God as the concrete object. God is the concrete ground of moral values, and then his commands are the basis for moral duties. So in that case, I would be a realist, but still not of the abstract type. If one were talking about abstract objects, I would still reject the existence of these moral abstract objects and instead go for the concrete realism.
Just to take a little bit further on that one, is there a distinction then between objects, as in the values, and that dimension of ethics that is about decision making, events happening? Is there a distinction there that perhaps could distinguish your position on?
I'm not sure. That
Anti-realism,
sounds
realism
like
with morals.
applied ethics to me more than
I'm applied
meta-ethics,
ethics,
which
yeah.
would be about what is your ontology of moral values. And so I don't know. You'd have to cash that out for me, I guess.
Another question. Yes, gentleman here.
Slightly off topic. With your work with abstract objects and moral realism, do you find there's any other objections to accepting something like atheistic moral Platonism instead of God as the foundation?
Well, okay, the question was, did I have any other objections to atheistic moral Platonism? And yes, in the book that is sitting before you on your desk, there's a discussion in the chapter on arguments for the existence of God of a kind of moral argument for God. And I consider the alternative of what I call atheistic moral Platonism, and I give 3 objections to that view that I think are very good objections myself. I find them persuasive, at least. So if you're interested in pursuing that further, take a look at that chapter in Reasonable Faith.
This gentleman there.
My question is similar to the one we asked a minute ago. You resolve the Euthyphro dilemma by saying you think that goodness is part of the intrinsic nature of God. Why don't you think that, in the same way that goodness is part of the intrinsic nature of God, why don't you think that mathematical truth is part of the intrinsic nature of God? Because if you ask the sort of Euthyphro dilemma for maths, is 2 plus 2 equal 4 because God says it, obviously you build something else.
Well, I'd have to see how that would work. It's not clear to me. You see, it seems to me that it makes sense to say that God is the good, not that it's intrinsic to his nature. That's a way of expressing it. You say God is essentially good, but there's an identity claim that God is the good. He is the concrete object, which is the paradigm of moral values. So God is the good. But it wouldn't make sense to say that God is a set, or that God is a number, or some kind of mathematical object. I just can't even make sense of that. So it would seem to me to be very different.
Wouldn't you be saying God is truth in a way?
No, again, I don't think you would say that God is truth, except in a metaphorical sense. We use the word true in English in a wide range of meanings, such as he was a true friend. This is true gold. His mark was true. All of those are uses of the word true in a non-alethic sense. It's not talking about truth versus falsehood. And certainly in these non-alethic senses, we can speak of God as the truth or being true. But we don't want to identify God with the value of a proposition being true or false, and that he's true. I think that's just purely a metaphorical use of the word true, or a non-alethic use of the word true to mean something like genuine, loyal, or something of that sort.
Yes. Yes, you, sorry, yes.
I have a question. If you say that God is good and that God has created everything, but the question is, so, unde malum, where does evil come from? And the doctrine of privatio boni,
The doctrine of what now?
privatio boni, of the private
Privatio
concept of God, private concept of evil, sorry, that considers evil as a lack, as a disorder in nature or in the world,
Yes.
is not adequate to express our experience of evil. So how could you find a solution?
Well, I addressed this question a little bit the first evening when someone asked whether or not John's statement in the prologue of the fourth gospel that God has created all things would mean that God created evil. And I said John would probably say that evil is not a thing. And that seems to me to be correct. Augustine developed this idea of evil as a privation. It's a privation of right order in the creaturely will. The creaturely will should be properly oriented toward God as the supreme good. God is the good, as we were just saying. So the creaturely will should be oriented toward God. But when the creature freely orients his will toward either finite goods or toward himself or other things than God, then there is a privation of right order, and that is evil. And that's a result of creaturely freedom, which is a great good. So anything that God has created is good, and it is due to human freedom, I would say, that evil arises in the creation.
Yes, but this can explain the moral evil, not the natural evil. It's a natural question.
Right. Okay. Well, lest we be diverted too far astray, let me say that I have an entire chapter on the problem of evil, both natural evil as well as moral evil, in the book Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. And I try to argue there that the presence of natural and moral evil in the world is neither logically compatible with God's existence, nor is it improbable with respect to God's existence, but that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting natural evil in the world. And so I would just simply refer you to that discussion in Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview.
Got another question down here, I think, arising from this.
Yeah, sorry, not trying to be awkward, but following on from that. If evil is an absence of good, as you were saying, how do we make sense of claims like Satan was, evil from the beginning, or a father of lies, whatever Jesus says? It seems to imply that he came out bad, But are you saying that somehow it happened so fast, it was almost like it was at the beginning? How do you square that?
In the sense that it is ancient and primordial, prior to human history, but I would take the view of the Church Fathers that this must have been some sort of angelic fall, that what we call Satan and demons are fallen angels. And again, the same thing would apply, that demonic evil is a result of a privation in the creaturely will. So that I don't think it really adds anything to what one might say of human evil. It's a privation of right order in the creaturely will due to creaturely freedom. And I would just add one other thing. My professor of philosophy once remarked that everything about Satan is good. That is to say, he has being, he has intelligence, he has power. All of these things are good. So that God, in creating this being, has created a good substance, a good thing. But because of freedom, creaturely freedom, those goods are perverted and twisted toward the service of things that are contrary to God, and therefore evil.
Another question here.
I know that you've recently spoken on how there's a remarkable fit between mathematics and reality.
Yes.
And I'm just trying to tie these two together. Is it that God has sort of invented maths and we sort of follow on from that and discover it? How do the two...
No, I'm not taking the view that God invented mathematics, but I am saying what Mary Lang was affirming, that mathematics is an uncannily effective tool in helping us to understand the physical world. The language of nature is the language of mathematics. And so by treating the world as a mathematical object, as having a mathematical structure, we can find out things about the way the world is. And so the question is, what's the best explanation of this uncanny applicability of mathematics to the physical world? This is actually one of the greatest objections to Platonism philosophically, because abstract objects, if they exist, are causally isolated from the physical world and have no effect upon it whatsoever. So how in the world could the existence of these abstract, causally effete objects have any impact upon or applicability to the physical world around us?
But if mathematics is only a fiction, why is telling us something about the world?
Now remember, fiction doesn't mean untruth. It means prescribed to be imagined. And we can imagine all sorts of mathematical theories, some of which will be applicable to the world and some will not. And so, for example, imagining that gases, or taking gases to approximate an ideal gas of continuous points is very useful in understanding the way real gases work. There is no such thing as an ideal gas. That's a mathematical fiction. But real gases approximate the behavior of an ideal continuous gas. And so this mathematical fiction can be very useful in understanding the way the world is.
Tom.
Maybe a silly question, but would you be an anti-realist when it comes to Aristotelianism?
To what?
Aristotle's theory.
Yes, I think so. And I must say, in reading contemporary Aristotelians, I don't find a unified voice. It's very, very difficult to understand exactly what contemporary Aristotelians are saying. If they're not simply divine conceptualists, then it would seem to me that there would be some species of absolute creationist. And then I'm not sure how they're going to avoid the bootstrapping objection.
So would you then apply like potence theory or anti-realist critiques to Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument?
I don't see why that would impact Aquinas' cosmological argument. I
suppose I'm just, perhaps it's a crude caricature of anti-realism. I'm just speculating. But in the sense that Thomas Aquinas sort of, do you think he makes an ontological commitment to essences?
To what?
Essence.
To what?
Essence.
I'm sorry.
To essences.
Oh, essences. Yes, I think that Aquinas, as far as I know, believed in essences. Oh, and you mean the third way.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the first two ways. Right, that is one of the reasons I would be skeptical of the third way based on the real distinction between essence and existence. It's not clear to me that things do have that sort of ontological structure, particularly if you think of essences as abstract entities. So, right, I think that would be problematic for that type of argument. And so I would go with a more Leibnizian sort of argument from contingency than Aquinas' third way.
Any other questions? We still have a few minutes left if there are. Gentlemen.
Sorry again. Do you find that there is any limits on omnipotence for God to follow logical truths and mathematical truths?
Well, I don't think so. Maybe, except I have expressed skepticism about the real existence of an actual infinite. And that's not logically contradictory. It seems to me that axiomatic set theory in postulating the axiom of infinity isn't doing anything that's illogical or inconsistent. But I don't take that to indicate that it's actually metaphysically possible that an actually infinite number of things could exist. So I guess I do have that peculiarity that it seems to me that the mere logical consistency of mathematical theories is not a guarantee of their metaphysical instantiability. Good point.
Yes.
Sorry, may I ask just one more question? I may have misunderstood, but I probably have. One of your sets of slides talked about number one, reasons not to be a realist. Number one, axioms. Number two, creativity of the maths. And number three, the incompleteness of mathematical entities. And I was just thinking, sort of off the top of my head almost, it strikes me that if you've got an entity, or if you make a proposition that's incomplete, so you use the incomplete entity, if you use a proposition that's incomplete or indeterminate, it's difficult to generate an actual contradiction with something that's incomplete. And yet we generate contradictions in maths all the time, I guess, or you could possibly generate a contradiction in maths. So could you talk a little bit about the incompleteness of a mathematical entity and how you can generate contradiction?
Well, I don't take it that incompleteness generates contradiction. I mean, Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that basic arithmetic is incomplete, but for all that, it's logically consistent as far as we know. It's never been demonstrated to be such, but it doesn't follow from incompleteness that you have a logical contradiction. And the kind of incompleteness that I was talking about was the fact that within certain axiomatic systems, certain sorts of objects don't seem to have a property or its opposite, that the continuum hypothesis neither follows from the axioms nor does its contradiction follow from the axioms. It's wholly independent. And so that struck me as being rather like the incompleteness of fictional objects with regard to, say, Hamlet's being left-handed or right-handed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I think I wasn't clear. What I mean is, if you've got something that's not complete, then it becomes difficult to find contradictions where things are not complete. And so...
well, couldn't you, though, you could find contradictions between those theorems that do follow from the axioms, and you could still find contradictions that way. Of course, you're right, there could always be lurking an unknown contradiction in the unknown part. But the incompleteness that we're talking about here, remember, is not simply that, say, the continuum hypothesis doesn't follow from the axioms. That could still leave you with some uncertainty. But when you show that neither the continuum hypothesis nor its contradictory follows from the axioms, then it seems to me it's just wholly independent, and there can't be any sort of contradiction lurking in the unknown there, because just neither of those is part of that fictional world generated by the axioms.
Yes, I agree, and yet it's possible to show, it's possible to generate contradictions in maths as far as
Sure.
I'm aware. And yet, where you have incompleteness, I see, if you like, a get-out clause for the contradiction. So you say, actually, there isn't a contradiction because there's an incompleteness. And so the fact that there's incompleteness is almost a side.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. If you've got a contradiction that follows from the axioms that you do know or do affirm, then you got an incoherent theory. And this is exactly what happened with naive 19th century set theory. It followed from Frege's fifth axiom that a set should be a member of itself if and only if it's not a member of itself. And it brought down 19th century naive set theory. It collapsed. And it was only this ad hoc fix of axiomatization that was able to save set theory by simply characterizing sets in such a way that such a set would not exist.
Thank you. One more question over there? Hand? No? Right, fine. I think that's probably it, and that's probably all the time we've got for questions. I'd like to close by inviting Professor Ken Dowden, who's the head of the school, to come and give a final thank you.
We've learnt about so much this week that I scarcely know where to begin. We have considered almost every aspect of existence and of the things in the world, beyond the world, in our minds, in our languages, in the mind of God. It has been a magnificent parade of knowledge, and it's been very invigorating to be part of that knowledge. At one point we talked about time, and we talked about nowness, the existence of a point in time which is now and its reality or otherwise. It seems to me that there is something more real than the now in time, and that's two nows. And it's getting from a now then to a now now. And it's the sense of the journey, isn't it? And this particular series of talks has been one of the most compellingly directional sets of talks that I can remember going to. And I think it's very interesting how it has progressed from the contemplation of the arseity of God, a word I did not know 24 hours before we started, but which now seems like child's play beside what we've been through. And as though to herald the conclusion of this series, the great sun himself hid his face this morning. As we classicists all know, this is a great and mighty portent. So I would thank you enormously for having taken us on your journey. I think a lot of us have learnt in the process something of what it is to be you. And I think it's been a most engaging set of talks for that very reason. We may have struggled with the concepts now and again, but we enjoy that. And the scale of the audience that has followed you through from night to night, I think shows very much the success of your project. We will look forward to your public lecture tomorrow night, which will be on the central stuff, on the stuff that takes you back to where you began, almost in the scholarly world. This will be at 5:30 tomorrow evening in the Barber Institute. 5:30, note, not 5 o'clock, 5:30. And it will be, if memory serves me, and I keep trying to remember this, on the kalam, cosmological argument for the existence of God. And I must say I enjoy nothing like ontology. It's absolutely wonderful. So might I call upon you all to express your gratitude for the journey that Bill has put us through this week and for the successful conclusion of this series.